It's been more than 30 years since the United States Congress required that research funded by the National Institutes of Health include people of color. While pharmaceutical clinical trial sponsors were encouraged to do the same, no mandate from regulatory agencies was issued to them. However, some progressive and enlightened big pharma companies have publicly and voluntarily declared a commitment to increasing diversity in clinical trials. There has been progress, but far too few companies have increasing diversity in clinical trials a research imperative. Clinical research is complex and expensive, growing more and more complex and more expensive in recent years. Recruiting adequate numbers of clinical trial participants has always been difficult, particularly in women and children and the aging populations. It is an even greater challenge for people of color. Racial and ethnic groups appear to participate in clinical trials in varying degrees. Blacks participated in trials to the greatest extent, however, their participation has steadily declined. People of Hispanic and Asian heritage appear to be far below their representation in the population. Clinical research is the foundation for the practice of evidence-based medicine. The more diverse the participant pool, the more confidence healthcare professionals have in study results and the benefits of the medicine to all people. It's just good, humane medicine, especially in the United States, as access to healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and consumer health products increases for racially diverse groups. Released in 2014, the FDA's action plan to enhance the collection and availability of subgroup data contained 27 recommendations that fell into three broad categories. 1, improve the completeness and quality of the demographic subgroup data contained within medical product applications. 2, identify barriers to enrolling members of demographic subgroups into clinical trials and utilize strategies to address those barriers. And 3, make demographic subgroup data more readily available to the public. The rhetoric abounds in the literature and in public forums about the need for including and increasing racially diverse groups in clinical research. Few sponsors knew that Robert F. Califf, MD, the former FDA Deputy Commissioner, had declared 2016 the year of diversity in clinical trials. Because of diversity underrepresentation, researchers continue to extrapolate trial data predominantly for white middle-aged men. This could be dangerous. Now that scientific data are available that demonstrate how different medicines may metabolize differently or may adversely affect patient populations in different ways. The frantic search for COVID-19 vaccines has brought this issue back on the national research agenda. The FDA's renewed attention to the absence of diversity will only continue to grow and will likely catch up with study sponsors when regulators demand additional post-marketing commitment studies or completely deny approval of an NDA. But as one study leader and enlightened professional and public health practitioner said for decades, people of color are not hard to reach, they are hardly reached. The barriers to recruiting people of color for clinical trials are individual, organizational, and systemic. The barriers go way beyond the historic mistrust and distrust of potential participants of color. Sponsors would do well to review the level of cultural competency of their recruitment and retention strategies. In the years that I have worked with sponsors to recruit more people of color, I have observed 5 areas that must be addressed and acknowledged for success. Number 1, the protocol. The inclusion and exclusion criteria of the protocol are often extremely restrictive. Sponsors must realize that will make them over-recruit in order to get the appropriate number of participants for a trial in terms of its outcomes. 2, selection of sites and site training. Sites that I have visited are not in neighborhoods of color or even near neighborhoods of color, making transportation a daunting barrier for potential participants. While site teams are trained in the clinical trial processes, they also need cultural competency training. They also need diversity education. They also need to have training in multicultural manners in order to improve the clinical trial experience of the participant. 3, principal investigators. We need more principal investigators of color who are racially and linguistically matched to the potential participants you're trying to recruit. That will go a long way to foster trust and trustworthiness and increase retention. 4, Sponsors must address the social determinants of health, which are more likely to impact a potential participant's willingness to volunteer. They include, but are not limited to, transportation, expenses, elder care, child care, health literacy. If the sponsor will address these social determinants of health proactively, there's a greater chance for success in recruitment and retention. Finally, number 5, community outreach and education. While each site is given a budget, they often do not know how to distribute that budget for community outreach. They may not know ethnic media. They may not know the community leaders that would be important to bring in who have the credible and trusted voices of the community. So these 5 areas are critical to success in recruiting people of color. If sponsors make an intentional effort to address these areas proactively, the chances for success in recruiting people of color for clinical trials are much greater. Remember, Albert Einstein said, "Insanity is when you keep doing the same thing and expect a different result." The barriers, perceived and real, that prevent underrepresented populations from participating in trials are well documented. Lack of awareness, cultural and language differences, socioeconomic obstacles, costs, study design, implicit and explicit racial bias, institutional racism, and reimbursement policies. The challenges to addressing the lack of diversity are individual, organizational, and systemic. It's time to move beyond the rhetoric and to implement comprehensive and inclusive protocols, plans, and strategies that address known barriers, uncover others, to facilitate and expedite the enrollment and retention of underrepresented populations. Enlightened companies that lead clinical trial diversity will build new bridges in both patients and doctors. Reaching underrepresented population requires new skills, a new mindset, new partners, and new competencies on the part of clinical trial leaders. It's time to discard the one-size-fits-all mentality of recruitment and retention strategies and replace them with culturally relevant strategies and tactics to successfully recruit diverse participants. You have to think outside the box. It's not enough to post flyers, design websites, secure an 800 number, or take out ads in a local newspaper. There's no way around it. The barriers of participation of diverse participants are formidable, but they are surmountable. If you're ready to go from rhetoric to reality in increasing diversity in clinical trials, I can work with you to assemble the nation's leading patient advocates, community-based leaders, investigators of color, to share best practices that we have learned and involve our voices and presence in the beginning of the clinical research process, not in the middle or at the end. We want to be in the room, at the table, not by the door and an afterthought. We know what to do. We know how to do it. And we know who should be in the forefront of this clinical research imperative. Before the middle of this century, 1 out of every 2 Americans will be a person of color or a person of color who speaks Spanish. So are you ready, and your clinical research team ready and prepared to embrace, respect, and celebrate multiculturalism in clinical research? Let's work together to begin this multicultural research journey from molecule to market. Let's stop talking about it and be about it. I'm Sheila Thorne. I look forward to hearing from you.